In my earlier video, I mentioned that famous or perhaps infamous statement that Islam is the world's fastest growing religion, implying that it could be a source of pride to certain Muslims. In other words, we are in a competition with the non-Islamic world, and simply by weight of numbers we will eventually win, which I don't believe that most Muslims subscribe to. I think they're simply going about their lives and just living. Whereas some Muslims, and I would call them, I guess, the more confrontational, I suppose, who believe that there is essentially a competition between the Islamic world and the West, such that numbers count. So if our numbers are increasing faster, time is on our side, we'll eventually dominate. Now, again, I don't really believe that most Muslims believe that, but I know that there is a certain constituency in the Islamic community that does believe this. And unfortunately, what they're doing is they're playing directly into the hands of people like Geert Wilders or various extreme right-wing Islamophobic people in the West who say that coexistence between the West and Islam is impossible, because essentially what the Muslim world wants to do is to dominate us and bring Sharia to our countries. So again, this business of being proud of the growth of Islam is in a sense a positive menace to the Muslims living in the West, who have no intention it doesn't even occur to them that their religion will one day or may one day dominate the West. They don't want this. They simply are living their lives and practicing their faith and just would like to be left alone. These people are the ultimate victims of any sort of confrontational Muslims gloating. They're the ones that are going to pay the price for this sort of thing, because again, they're putting ammunition into the guns of people like Geert Wilders, and by guns I mean metaphorically speaking. I should say that they're essentially writing Geert Wilders' speeches for him. Perhaps that's a more pacifistic way of putting it. Now, there are other implications to this statement. And one of the interesting spins that have come off of that is this business of how Islamic people should conduct themselves in non-Islamic countries. The general fatwa is, I think it's called a fatwa, is that Muslims, if they're not living in an Islamic country, should definitely obey the law of the land in a Muslim country. They should do their utmost to avoid causing trouble or offense in a non-Muslim country, and they should show their loyalty to the rulers of that country, obey the laws, pay their taxes. They should, I think it's explained that they should feel themselves under a covenant with the people in the non-Islamic country that they live in. Okay, now that on the surface of it looks like a very laudable thing. It's encouraging non-Muslims to be loyal to their adopted countries. And hopefully that doesn't result in some sort of conflict with the Islamic world. Usually it doesn't, but I suppose it can on occasion. But this begs the somewhat awkward question: what constitutes a Muslim country? And how should a Muslim conduct himself in a Muslim country? Because we've got here, at the very heart of this idea is the idea that there are Muslim countries and there are non-Muslim countries, and that a Muslim should behave himself one way in a non-Muslim country and in another way in a Muslim country. I'm not saying that that is actually the case, but that's a certain way of reading this sort of thing. Okay, well, what's the big deal? When I'm in Saudi Arabia, I behave myself the way the Saudis expect people to behave, and when I'm in the Netherlands, I behave myself the way the Dutch people expect people to behave, and okay, what's the big deal here? Well, the problem is, of course, we get back to that demographics issue. Now, again, let's just assume that there is a constituency in the Islamic world that says that the growth of the Islamic population in this world, or the growth of the proportion of Muslims in this world, is a good thing. What does that mean in terms of Islamic versus non-Islamic countries? Now, the implication is that when you take this argument in tandem with the growth of the Muslim population and this idea of Muslim versus non-Muslim countries, and the fact that Muslim demographics seem to show an increase in the Islamic population in non-Muslim countries, is there some sort of possibility in probably the remotest of futures, and certainly not in my lifetime, but is there an assumption in the back of some people's minds in the Islamic community? I would call these people the hardliners, the confrontational types, that eventually European countries will eventually embrace Islam, or enough of them, a critical mass will do that, to the point where European Western countries will then become Muslim countries, and then we can say that the way that things are done in a Muslim country can then come to the West. Now again, I'm not saying that most Muslims believe this. In fact, I think that the overwhelming majority of Muslims would scoff at the idea. But again, it's just, there is that underlying sense of unease that kind of reasoning causes in people. Because if there is this very strong split between how a Muslim should behave outside of the Islamic world versus how he should behave inside of the Islamic world, coupled with the idea that Muslims should increase their share of the world's population, and that converting non-Muslims in the non-Muslim world is a good thing, where is this going? Where is this militating towards? And again, this also has to be taken into consideration when considering the fact that Muslims are free to propagate their religion in the non-Islamic world. It's perfectly okay to go out and proselytize, and I, for one, think that should not change. If anyone in the West wants to embrace Islam, they should be allowed to. But you cannot do the reverse. Now, this is where things get awkward. One rule for the Islamic world, one rule for the West. The Muslims of the world can preach and increase their numbers and their influence and their converts in non-Islamic lands, but absolutely never must it be allowed for non-Muslims to preach in Muslim lands. Now, I, for one, don't really want to see foreign preachers in Saudi Arabia or whatever. I have no desire to do that. I don't even want to see atheists trying to get people to become atheists in Saudi Arabia. None whatsoever. I have no intention or no sympathy for that whatsoever. But again, when you put these various pieces of the puzzle together, this belief that the increase in the number of Muslims is a good thing, the fact that Muslim proselytism is encouraged in the West, but forbidden in the Western proselytism is forbidden in the Islamic world, and that Muslims should behave according to non-Muslim standards when they're in the non-Muslim world, but only when they're in the non-Muslim world. All of that put together can make some people very uneasy. And again, the biggest victims of that kind of mindset, which a small minority, I believe, of Muslims may have in this world, the biggest victims of that are the Muslims that are living among us in the West, because some people might think, based upon all this rhetoric that you hear coming out of certain people in the Islamic world, that the Muslims in the West really are a Trojan horse. Now, I'm not saying that that I'm agreeing with people like Geert Wilders. I think the man is a menace to society. Pat Condell, I think, is beneath contempt. But what I'm saying is, we've got to deal with the confrontational type of Muslim in the same way as we have to deal with the confrontational type of Westerner. Because when you have a mindset on both sides that there's a competition going on, that creates a situation in which each side believes that it has to defend itself against the other. What I would like to see is a mindset of coexistence, of live and let live, with no assumption that the West will one day overwhelm the Islamic world with its mass culture and technology and military might, or the assumption that the Muslims of this world will one day out-convert us all. I don't like any of that sort of thing. And I like to warn people, I guess, against the effect of what rhetoric they may use is having on the other side. I know perfectly well what the effect of Pat Condell's rhetoric is. But again, when we do see people like Zakir Naik, who seems to say that the increase in the number of Muslims in the world is a a good thing, and that it is a possibility. This seems to be latent in what he's saying, even though he doesn't actually say it, that one day perhaps some Western countries may end up becoming Islamic states. That is guaranteed to put non-Muslim countries on edge and make them resentful, and they of course will then pass on their sense of discomfort to the Muslims living among them. I guess what I'm really getting at here is, I think that even when people think that their rhetoric is harmless, the effect that it's having on other people can be out of all proportion to what is actually meant. Again, this is in no way attempting to bring up an inflammatory subject. I'm not trying to say that anyone is out to get anyone else, and I will block or delete any comments from anyone who uses this to start speaking in an inflammatory way. This is a very sensitive subject, but I think that it cries out for sane debate. Thank you.